When I moved into that house, I was just looking for a quiet place to settle in. I had just relocated for work, some tech job that paid well, but left me with little time to actually enjoy life. The house was nothing fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was unfurnished, which was fine since I hadn't gotten around to buying furniture yet. That first night, I set up an air mattress in the living room, too tired to care about how empty the place felt. The air smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in months, and the floors groaned under my steps. I chalked it up to the house being old, the kind of place that creaks and settles when the temperature drops. I must have dozed off around midnight, the kind of deep, exhausted sleep that comes after a long day of moving. I don't know how long I was out before the sound woke me up. A faint creaking, slow and deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on an old wooden floor. I told myself it was nothing, the house settling, the wind outside, anything but what my gut was already telling me. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, breathing. Shallow, controlled breaths, like someone was trying to stay quiet. My own breath hitched in my throat. I turned my head slightly toward the direction of the sound, my pulse hammering in my ears. Fumbling in the dark, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The moment the light cut through the shadows, the noises stopped. I sat up, scanning the room, but saw nothing, just the empty space, my lone air mattress in the middle of the floor, and the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the window blinds. But then I noticed it, the back door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of cold night air to seep in. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. Heart pounding, I stood up slowly, creeping toward the door, phone still clutched in my shaking hand. I reached out and pressed it shut, twisting the lock tight. Then, for good measure, I grabbed one of my suitcases and pushed it against the door. I barely slept after that. Every sound made me flinch. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had just forgotten to lock the door. But the feeling wouldn't leave me, that eerie sensation of not being alone. By morning, my exhaustion was outweighed by a nagging sense of unease. I called the landlord, a guy named Rick, who seemed surprised to hear from me so soon. I explained what happened, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he sighed. "Look, man, I probably should have mentioned this before, but the last tenant? He refused to leave after getting evicted. We had to change the locks, but..." Another pause. "We never checked the attic." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. The attic. My eyes instinctively flicked toward the ceiling, as if I expected to hear something shift above me at that exact moment. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Rick sighed again. "I mean, I don't know if he's still there. Could be nothing. But, might be worth checking." He said it like it was no big deal, like I should just grab a ladder and poke my head up there to see if some stranger had been living above me. I wanted to tell him to come check it himself, but I could already guess how that would go. This was my problem now. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But no matter how much I rationalized, the thought gnawed at me. What if someone had been up there last night, watching me? I needed to know. So I did something incredibly stupid. I grabbed a broom from the kitchen, dragged a chair beneath the attic hatch in the hallway, and reached up to push it open. The panel was stiff, but with a little force, it popped upward, revealing nothing but darkness. A rush of stale, dusty air seeped down, carrying the unmistakable scent of old sweat. My heart was hammering. Slowly, I angled my phone's flashlight and lifted it toward the opening. The attic was small, just exposed wooden beams and pink insulation. But as I moved the light around, my breath caught in my throat. In the farthest corner, nestled between the beams, was a flattened sleeping bag. Beside it, empty food wrappers, a half-crushed water bottle, and the worst part, a single grimy sock, abandoned like someone had left in a hurry. I swallowed hard, my hands clammy around the broom handle. Someone had been living here, maybe for months, maybe up until last night. I yanked the attic panel shut so fast that dust rained down over me. My whole body felt cold, like I had just stepped into a freezer. I called Rick back immediately, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, you need to come over, now." He was hesitant, but when I told him what I found, he finally agreed. I spent the next 20 minutes pacing the living room, every muscle in my body tensed, listening for any sound. When Rick finally arrived, he was exactly what I expected. Mid-40s, balding, wearing a stained flannel shirt like he had just crawled out of bed. "All right," he said, rubbing his face. "Let's check this out." I half expected him to dismiss everything, but when he climbed up and peeked inside the attic himself, he let out a low whistle. "Jesus." That's all he said at first. Then he muttered, "Yeah, we need to call the cops." The police arrived about 30 minutes later. 2 officers, one younger guy who looked fresh out of the academy, and an older one who had the tired, no-nonsense look of someone who'd seen too much weird shit in his career. They asked me and Rick a few questions before one of them climbed up into the attic. He was up there for a while, moving things around, shining his flashlight into the corners. When he finally came back down, his face was unreadable. "Whoever was staying up there, they're gone now," he said, dusting off his uniform. "But it wasn't just a place to sleep. There's a small hole in the ceiling, right above where your air mattress was." I felt my stomach drop. "What?" I managed to choke out. The officer nodded. "Looks like he carved out a spot between the beams, small enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, but big enough to watch." His words sent a deep, crawling sensation through my skin. I thought back to the night before, the way I had woken up feeling watched. It hadn't been in my head. I had been watched. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, like the whole thing creeped him out as much as it did me. "We'll check around the property," he said. "See if we can find any signs of forced entry or where he might have gone." While they searched the backyard, I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. The idea that someone had been up there, silently staring down at me while I slept, made my skin crawl. And it wasn't just last night. He could have been there when I moved in, maybe before that. How many times had he watched me without me knowing? My head was spinning by the time the officers returned. "We found footprints near the back fence," the older one said. "Looks like he took off when you turned the lights on last night. Probably wasn't expecting you to wake up." Rick exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "Christ, and you're sure he's gone?" The officer shrugged. "For now, but I'd suggest you change the locks again. Maybe put in some cameras." Then he turned to me. "If you hear or see anything else, anything at all, call us." I nodded, but my mind was barely registering his words. I kept picturing that small hole in the attic, the one I never would have noticed, the one that had been watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. Even after Rick had a locksmith replace every lock in the house, even after double-checking every window, every door, I lay awake in the dark, listening, waiting. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every creak of the house made my heart pound. I found myself checking the attic hatch at least 3 times a night, half expecting it to be open, but it never was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, that I was never really alone. I thought about breaking the lease, getting out before something worse happened, but moving again so soon wasn't an option. So instead, I did what the cops suggested. I installed cameras. One in the living room, one pointed at the back door, and one in the hallway, angled just below the attic hatch. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. The house was silent, still. I started to believe it was over, that whoever had been living up there had really left for good. Then, on the 3rd night, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the hallway camera. My stomach clenched. With shaky hands, I opened the app. At first, the screen showed nothing, just the dimly lit hallway, the attic hatch untouched. But then, at the edge of the frame, something moved. A shadow. Just for a second. Like someone had been standing at the top of the stairs and ducked out of view the moment the camera detected motion. My blood turned ice cold. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and I got the hell out of there. Drove straight to a motel on the other side of town and sat awake in bed, staring at my phone, waiting for another alert. But none came. The next morning, I went back, but I didn't go inside alone. I called the cops again. When they arrived, they did a full sweep of the house, checking every room, every closet, the basement, and finally, the attic. It was empty. But something was different this time. The sleeping bag was gone. The food wrappers, the sock, everything. Like no one had ever been there at all. That was enough for me. I told Rick I was breaking the lease, and I didn't care about the penalties. He didn't argue. Maybe he felt guilty for not checking the attic before renting the place out, or maybe he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. Either way, I packed up and left that same day. I still don't know who that guy was or how long he had been living there, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that small hole in the ceiling. And I wonder how many times I fell asleep, completely unaware that someone was watching me from above. I moved into the house on a quiet Thursday evening. It was a small rental on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you take when you need something cheap and temporary. I wasn't planning to stay long, just a few months while I figured things out. The house itself was nothing special. A single story with faded blue siding, a patchy lawn, and a mailbox that leaned forward like it had given up. It smelled like dust and old wood inside, but it was mine, at least for now. I spent most of that first night unpacking and getting used to the creaks in the floorboards. Around 9 p.m., there was a knock on the door. Not loud, not rushed, just 3 slow knocks. I opened the door to find an older man standing there, late 50s, maybe early 60s. He was tall and thin, with tired eyes and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. His clothes were plain, faded jeans, a beige jacket zipped up to his neck. He had this blankness about him, like a TV tuned to a dead channel. "Hey there," he said, voice flat. "Saw you moving in. Just wanted to introduce myself." His name was Richard, but he didn't offer a last name. I shook his hand out of politeness, even though something about his presence made my skin itch. He didn't blink much. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Yeah," he muttered, his eyes drifting past me into the house. "Quiet place? Hope you like it." And then he just stood there. I waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring past me, like he was waiting for an invitation inside. The silence stretched too long, and I felt this weird, irrational pressure in my chest. "All right, well, I've got a lot to unpack," I said, stepping back, hand on the door. "Nice meeting you, Richard." He blinked slow, once, then gave a tiny nod. "See you around," he said, turning and walking off into the night. I locked the door. Something about that guy unsettled me, but I told myself he was just awkward, maybe lonely. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail, and there he was again, standing on the sidewalk, hands in his jacket pockets. I almost didn't notice him at first. He blended into the dull morning like he belonged there. "Morning," he said, his tone just as empty as before. "Morning," I replied, trying not to sound irritated. "How's the house?" he asked. Good," I said, pulling the mail from the box. I didn't have anything else to say, but he just stood there, watching me. The silence stretched again. I felt the same pressure in my chest as before. Then, after what felt like forever, he nodded and walked off, just like the night before. By the third day, it wasn't just strange, it was intrusive. I'd be outside grabbing something from my car, and there he'd be, standing just a little too close, asking meaningless questions. "How's the place treating you? Getting settled?" I kept my responses short, hoping he'd take the hint, but he never did. The worst part was that he never actually knocked again. He just showed up. I'd look out my window and see him standing near the edge of my yard, hands in his pockets, staring at the house like he was waiting for something. By the fourth day, I stopped acknowledging him altogether. I'd pretend not to notice him, pretend I was on the phone, anything to avoid those dead-eyed stares. But he never stopped coming. One evening, I worked late and didn't get home until close to midnight. The street was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and the distant hum of cars on the highway. I was exhausted, ready to collapse into bed, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air felt wrong, heavy. I flipped the light switch in the living room. Nothing. Power outage? No, the streetlights were still on outside. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight and moved toward the kitchen. And that's when I saw him. Richard was standing in the dark, just past the kitchen doorway. Perfectly still, hands at his sides. His face was half lit by the glow of my phone, and his eyes, those same tired, unblinking eyes, were locked onto me like he'd been waiting. My breath caught in my throat. My body locked up. He wasn't surprised to see me. He wasn't scared. He was just there. "What the hell?" I started, but my voice cracked, and before I could finish, he took a slow step forward. That broke me out of it. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone, and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock as I heard him take another step behind me. The second the door flew open, I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, doors locked, hands shaking. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, trying to explain between gasping breaths that there was a man inside my house. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line until officers arrived. It took them less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an hour. When they finally went in, I stayed outside, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. A few minutes later, one of the officers came back out and shook his head. "Nobody's in there," he said. "No signs of forced entry." My stomach dropped. "He was standing in my kitchen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before looking back at me. "Doors were all locked when we got here. No broken windows. Are you sure you didn't leave a door open earlier?" I knew I hadn't left a door open. I knew what I saw. But standing there in the cold, with two cops looking at me like I might have imagined the whole thing, I started questioning myself. Maybe he had a key. Maybe I had locked up behind him without realizing. Or maybe, no, I wasn't crazy. He was there. I thanked the officers, told them I'd call if anything else happened, and forced myself to go back inside. I locked every door, checked every window, sat on my couch with a baseball bat in my lap, staring at the kitchen doorway like he might step back into it at any second. I barely slept. Every tiny creak in the house made my heart race. I kept expecting to see him again, just standing there. But nothing happened. The next morning, I called my landlord. I told him everything. The way Richard kept showing up, the way he stared, the way he had somehow gotten into my house. I was expecting concern, maybe even an apology. Instead, there was a pause, followed by a tired sigh. "Oh yeah," he said, like I just reminded him of a forgotten chore. "That guy used to live there. He must still have a key." My stomach turned. "You knew?" I asked, my voice sharp. "And you didn't think to change the locks?" He exhaled loudly, clearly annoyed. "Look, I didn't think it was a big deal. I'll get someone out there to swap them this week." That was it. No urgency, no real concern. Just a casual brush-off, like I'd told him my sink was dripping. I didn't wait for him to send someone. I went out that afternoon and bought new locks myself. Changed them all before the sun went down. That night, for the first time since moving in, I felt safe. But that feeling didn't last long. A few days later, I came home and found something on my doorstep. A single key. Old and tarnished, just lying there, like a message. No note, No explanation, just the key. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, heart hammering in my chest. Then, without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it into the storm drain at the end of the driveway. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was nothing. But I never saw Richard again. I moved out 2 months later. The house never felt right after that. Every time I came home, I half expected to find him waiting, just standing in the dark, watching. Even now, I get this weird feeling when I think about him, like he's still out there somewhere, still watching. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know why he kept coming back. But the worst part? Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard slow, deliberate knocking at my door. I moved into this house with my roommate, Eric, about 6 months ago. It was in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind where people actually wave when you drive by. Rent was decent, and the place had a big backyard, seemed perfect for 2 guys in their 20s just trying to figure life out. Eric worked as a bartender, which meant he was usually out late, while I had a more typical 9-to-5 job. We barely crossed paths during the week, but it worked out. I'd come home to an empty house most nights, and by the time I woke up, Eric was usually passed out in his room. Nothing weird ever happened. Until that night. It was a little after midnight when I pulled into the driveway. Eric's car wasn't there, which wasn't surprising. He usually stayed at his girlfriend's place after his shifts. What was surprising, though, was the front door. It wasn't closed all the way, just slightly open, barely enough to notice, but enough to make my stomach drop. I sighed, assuming Eric had left in a rush and forgot to lock up. Annoying, but not unheard of. Still, something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the night air settled too still around me, or maybe it was just my brain overthinking things. Either way, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark. That wasn't unusual either. I preferred it that way when I was home alone. But as I took a few steps in, my eyes landed on the kitchen counter. Eric's keys, his wallet, his phone charger, everything he usually carried when he left. My pulse quickened. If he had stayed home tonight, the lights would be on. The TV would be playing some mindless reality show. There'd be an empty pizza box on the coffee table. But the house was dead silent. I called out his name. My voice sounded thin in the darkness, like it didn't belong here. No answer. My gut twisted, and I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I hesitated for a second before texting Eric. Me, "Hey, are you home?" The reply came almost instantly. Eric, "Nah, man, been at Rachel's all night. What's up?" I froze. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin. Slowly, I turned toward the staircase. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak behind me. The closet door. I didn't move. I couldn't. My entire body locked up as my brain scrambled to make sense of what was happening. The house was supposed to be empty. Eric wasn't here. No one else was supposed to be here. And yet, the closet door, the one right by the front entrance, had just creaked open. Not from the wind, not from the house settling. This was slow, controlled, like someone had been waiting for the right moment. My phone was still in my hand, my fingers gripping it so tightly they ached. I barely managed to type out another message. Me. "Dude, someone's in the house." My thumb hovered over the send button, but I never got to press it. Another sound broke the silence, a single, dragging step from inside the closet. My breath hitched. I turned my head just enough to glance over my shoulder, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see inside. My entire body was screaming at me to run, to get out now, but my feet felt cemented to the floor. Then, in the periphery of my vision, something shifted in the darkness. A shape. A figure standing just behind the cracked door. Adrenaline finally snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted toward the kitchen, my socks slipping on the hardwood as I rounded the counter. I needed something, a weapon, an exit, anything. I yanked open the silverware drawer, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the knife I grabbed. The house was still silent. Too silent. I expected footsteps, a rush of movement, but nothing came. Just that unbearable, suffocating quiet. My breathing was too loud in my own ears. I wanted to scream, but some primal instinct told me not to make a sound. I forced myself to move toward the back door. My fingers fumbled with the lock. Click. I turned the knob and started to push it open. Slam. A deafening crash from the front of the house. My head whipped around, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The closet door was wide open now, swinging slightly as if someone had just stepped out. But no one was there. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The closet was empty, or at least it looked empty. But I knew someone had been in there. I heard them. I felt them. My grip on the knife tightened as I backed toward the door. Every hair on my body stood on end, my instincts screaming that I wasn't alone. I glanced toward the staircase again, my mind racing through possibilities. Could someone have slipped out the second I turned my back? Was there another person hiding somewhere, waiting? I needed to get out. Now. I yanked the back door open, but before I could step outside, a single, deliberate tap echoed from upstairs. My stomach twisted. It wasn't random. It was intentional, like someone letting me know they were there. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. Eric. Bro, call 911, now. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. He was right. I should have done that the second I heard the closet door creak, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. The second I looked down to dial, another sound made my breath catch. Soft footsteps, coming down the stairs. I didn't wait. I bolted through the door and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop until I was across the yard, standing in the middle of the street, panting like I'd just sprinted a marathon. My hands fumbled as I finally managed to call 911. I barely registered what I was saying. Something about an intruder, someone in my house. Please send help. The dispatcher was calm, asked if I was safe. I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't see anyone leave, didn't see a face, just shadows, sounds, movements that didn't make sense. The cops arrived within minutes, flooding the street with red and blue lights. I watched from the sidewalk as they cleared the house, weapons drawn. One of them eventually came back out, shaking his head. "Nobody's inside," he said. "No signs of forced entry. Nothing's been taken." My stomach churned. That didn't make sense. Eric's door was locked, his things were there, and I knew what I heard. But there was no sign of anyone. I stood there, gripping my phone like a lifeline, trying to process what the cop had just said. No one was inside. That wasn't possible. I heard the footsteps. I heard the closet door. I wasn't imagining it. My body still buzzed with the raw fear of it. But the officers weren't convinced. One of them gave me a standard lecture about making sure my doors were locked, then asked if I had any enemies, anyone who might have been trying to scare me. I told him no, but honestly, that almost would have been better. At least then, I'd have an explanation. Eric showed up about 15 minutes later, still in his work uniform, his face pale under the flashing lights. "Dude, what the hell happened?" I barely had the words to explain. When I told him what I saw, what I heard, he didn't laugh it off or call me paranoid. Instead, his expression darkened. "I swear to God, man," he muttered. "Last week, I thought I heard someone breathing in my room when I was trying to sleep, but when I turned the light on, nothing was there." I stared at him. He hadn't told me that. Why hadn't he told me that? The cops left after a while, and we went back inside together. Everything was exactly how I left it. The open closet door, the knife still on the counter, the back door unlocked. But the house felt different, heavier, like something unseen had settled into the walls. We didn't stay long. Eric grabbed some clothes, and we crashed at Rachel's place that night. I barely slept, every sound making my skin crawl. The next day, we changed the locks, set up cameras, but nothing else ever happened. No break-ins, no weird noises. Just an uneasy feeling that never fully went away. We moved out a couple of months later, and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that creaking door and the soft footsteps on the stairs. If no one was inside that night, who the hell was I hearing? When my wife, Emily, and I bought our first home, we knew we had a lot of work ahead of us. It was an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with creaky floors and drafty windows, but we fell in love with it instantly. The price was suspiciously low, but the realtor shrugged it off, saying the previous owner had passed away and the family just wanted to sell quickly. It needed renovations, badly. The basement, in particular, was a disaster, with peeling walls, a musty smell, and dim, flickering light bulbs that barely illuminated the space. But we were excited, eager to turn this house into something beautiful, something ours. A few weeks into the renovations, we were clearing out old junk from the basement when we found it, a small, almost invisible door hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden boards. It was about 4 feet high, barely noticeable against the wall, and sealed shut with old, rusted nails. Emily chuckled, thinking it was probably just some old storage closet, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the way it was sealed, but the way the nails had been hammered in, like someone had wanted to keep something inside. Still, curiosity got the best of me, and after some prying with a crowbar, the door gave way with a deep, splintering groan. Inside was a tiny, windowless room. The air was thick with a stale, almost rotten scent, and dust swirled in the dim light from our flashlights. There was a single cot shoved against the wall, its mattress yellowed with age, and a rusty can of beans resting on the floor. But what disturbed me the most was the chair, an old wooden chair positioned directly in front of the door, as if someone had spent hours, maybe days, just sitting there, watching. Emily muttered something about the previous owner being a survivalist or a recluse, and though I nodded, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The space felt off. But in the end, we dismissed it. Just another weird relic from an old house. We left the door open and went back to our renovations. That night, our dog, Cooper, started growling at the basement door. At first, we thought he was just unsettled by all the changes, new smells, new noises, but this was different. His body was stiff, ears pinned back, a deep, guttural growl rumbling from his throat as he stared at the basement door like something was on the other side. I checked. Nothing. But it kept happening, night after night. Every evening around the same time, Cooper would sit by the door, staring, growling, sometimes whining low in his throat. It was enough to make my skin crawl, but we told ourselves it was just a phase, that he'd get used to it. Then, a week later, we woke up to the sound of the basement door creaking open on its own. The sound jolted me awake instantly. At first, I thought I had imagined it, the kind of half-dream noise that fades the moment you fully wake up. But then, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, like wood straining under weight. Emily stirred beside me, murmuring groggily, but I put a hand on her arm, signaling her to stay still. The house was silent except for Cooper, who was now growling low and steady from the foot of the bed. My heart pounded as I swung my legs over the side and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. I didn't want to go downstairs. Every instinct in me screamed to stay put, to ignore it. But I had to see. As I crept toward the basement door, my skin prickled with a deep, almost primal unease. The door was open, just a few inches, but enough to make my stomach lurch. It had been shut when we went to bed. I was sure of it. My first thought was that maybe we hadn't latched it properly, that it had swung open on its own. But as I stepped closer, the air around me felt wrong, heavy, like the kind of pressure you feel before a storm. I reached out and pushed the door fully open, aiming my flashlight down the basement steps. The beam wavered slightly, my hands unsteady, and that's when I saw it. Something had moved. The chair in the hidden room was no longer facing the door. It was turned, angled slightly to the side. I felt my chest tighten. I knew, without a doubt, that neither Emily nor I had touched that chair after we opened the hidden room. It had been facing the door, unmoved for God knows how long. And now it was turned, just enough that if someone had been sitting there, they wouldn't be looking directly at the door anymore. They'd be looking at the stairs, at me. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the air pressure had shifted it somehow. Maybe we had bumped it earlier without realizing it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I closed the basement door, locked it, and went back upstairs, my mind racing. I barely slept that night, my ears straining for any sound, but the house remained silent. The next morning, Emily found me in the kitchen, bleary-eyed and tense. She took one look at my face and sighed. "It's the chair, isn't it?" she said. I stared at her, startled. "You noticed it too?" She nodded, rubbing her arms like she was cold. "I didn't want to say anything last night, but yeah. I know we didn't move it, and I don't like that it moved on its own." We stood there for a moment, silent, both of us unwilling to say what we were really thinking. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I think we should close up that room, seal it back up." I nodded, relieved that I wasn't the only one who felt that way. We agreed to do it that night, after work, but by then, it was too late. That night, just as we were getting ready to seal the room back up, something happened that made us reconsider staying in the house at all. It started with Cooper. He had been uneasy all evening, pacing near the basement door, letting out these short, anxious whines. But as soon as we brought the wooden boards downstairs, ready to nail them over the small door, he lost it. He bolted down the steps before we could stop him, barking wildly, his body rigid like he was ready to attack. I rushed after him, my pulse hammering, and that's when I saw it, the chair. It had moved again. This time, it was directly in the center of the room, perfectly positioned, as if someone had just stood up from it. I froze. Emily was right behind me, clutching my arm, whispering, "We didn't do that." My mouth was dry. No, we didn't. The room had been left untouched since the night before. There was no draft, no logical explanation. It had moved. My eyes flicked to Cooper, who was still barking, his fur bristling, but he wasn't looking at the chair. He was looking at the farthest, darkest corner of the room. I hesitated, then slowly lifted my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust-heavy air, and that's when I saw it, a handprint, smudged onto the wall, just above the cot. It wasn't old, wasn't faded. It was fresh, like someone had just pressed their palm against the wall and dragged it downward. A wave of nausea hit me. Emily gasped, pulling me back, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, raw and real. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. I didn't argue. We didn't even bother covering the hidden door. We just locked the basement, packed some essentials, and left to stay at a motel for the night. The next morning, we called a contractor and told him to seal the damn thing shut. Nails, boards, cement, whatever it took. I didn't care. I just wanted that room gone. We finished the rest of the renovations, but the house never felt right after that. The air always seemed heavier in the evenings, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the sickening certainty that someone was standing at the foot of our bed, watching. We sold the house a few months later. Took a loss on it, didn't care. I don't know who lives there now, and honestly, I don't want to. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that chair, the way it moved, the way it seemed to be waiting for someone. And I wonder if, even now, it's still down there, facing the door, waiting. I moved into my new apartment at the beginning of last summer. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom unit in an older building on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and I liked the big windows that let in plenty of light. It felt like a fresh start after a rough breakup, and I was excited to have a space that was entirely mine. The first few weeks were uneventful, just me settling in, arranging my furniture, and getting used to the creaky floors and thin walls. The neighbors were quiet, the landlord was nice enough, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Then, small things started happening. At first, I barely noticed them. A cabinet door left slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. A fork in the sink when I hadn't used one. A faint, lingering scent in the hallway outside my bedroom, something I couldn't quite place. I figured I was just adjusting to the space, maybe being forgetful. Moving is stressful, and I had a lot on my mind. But then, I started noticing food missing from my fridge. Not entire meals, just little things. A half-eaten yogurt cup I didn't remember opening. A slice of bread gone from the loaf. It was weird, but again, I reasoned it away. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was distracted. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted, and went straight to bed without eating. The next morning when I opened the fridge, the carton of milk I had bought the day before was half empty. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I lived alone. No one had a key except me. I tried to convince myself that I must have poured a glass and forgotten, but a feeling settled deep in my stomach. A quiet, nagging discomfort that wouldn't go away. I started double-checking everything, locking the front door twice, making mental notes of where I left things. It felt ridiculous, but something wasn't right. Then, a few nights later, I woke up to the sound of water running. At first, I thought it was a dream, that hazy kind where reality and imagination blur together. But as I blinked myself awake, I realized it was coming from my bathroom. A slow, steady stream. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, my body frozen with that primal fear of knowing you are supposed to be alone, but you're not. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening to the water run. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I told myself it had to be a plumbing issue, maybe an old pipe, maybe I hadn't turned the faucet off all the way earlier. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't used the bathroom since getting home. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I turned on the flashlight, the dim glow casting strange shadows on the walls. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, my bare feet barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. The apartment felt different, heavier, like something unseen was pressing against the walls, waiting. I stepped into the hallway leading to the bathroom, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I had to see. I had to know. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. The light was off, but the water was still running. I pushed the door open with my foot, holding my phone out in front of me. The sink faucet was on, a thin stream of water trickling down the drain. Nothing else seemed out of place. No movement, no sound except for my own breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I swallowed hard and reached out, turning the faucet off. Silence. Just me, standing there, staring at my own pale reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked wide, haunted. I turned around to leave, my pulse still racing, and that's when I saw it. The closet door in the hallway. It was open just a crack. I knew for a fact it had been shut before I went to bed. My body went cold. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. I couldn't move. My whole body felt like it had locked up, every muscle tense to the point of pain. The closet was just a few feet away, the door slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I told myself that maybe I hadn't closed it all the way earlier. That was the only explanation that made sense, right? But the problem was, I didn't open that closet at all that day. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took a slow step back toward my bedroom, keeping my eyes locked on the closet door. Then, in one quick motion, I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from the hallway table, and yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. A few jackets, a stack of towels, some old moving boxes. No one was inside, but the air smelled different. Stale, like someone had been breathing in there for too long. And then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The floor of the closet, near the back wall, was scuffed, scratched up, like something had been dragged across it repeatedly. My stomach twisted as I reached out and ran my fingers along the edge of the back panel. It wobbled slightly under my touch. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. I stared at the panel, my fingers still pressed against the edge. My skin prickled with a deep, unsettling realization. This wasn't just some odd quirk of the apartment. Someone had been in here. Someone had been living here. My throat was dry as I pressed my hand against the panel and gave it a gentle push. It shifted slightly, revealing a thin gap of darkness beyond. A crawl space. My stomach lurched. I had heard stories about this kind of thing. People finding hidden rooms in old buildings, strangers secretly living in their homes. But this wasn't a story. This was my apartment. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. I needed to call the police. I needed to get out. But before I could move, a sound came from inside the crawl space, a quiet, deliberate inhale. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. My hands fumbled as I grabbed my keys from the counter, my mind screaming at me to hurry. I could feel the presence behind me, something shifting in the dark, something just beyond the closet door. I didn't look back. I yanked open the front door and bolted into the hallway, my breath ragged as I sprinted down the stairs 2 at a time. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing barefoot on the cold pavement, my heart slamming against my ribs. I stood outside, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What if they thought I was overreacting? What if they got there and found nothing? But then I thought about the missing food, the open cabinets, the closet door, the breathing. I dialed 911. My voice was a mess, stumbling over words as I tried to explain what had happened. They told me to stay put, and within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. The officers listened as I repeated my story, still struggling to catch my breath. I could tell they were skeptical until they went inside. One of them found the crawl space almost immediately. The panel had been moved even more, as if someone had tried to slip out after I ran. When they pried it open, they found a narrow passage leading to an old maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the building. And inside that tunnel, a sleeping bag, a few empty food wrappers, and a backpack filled with clothes that weren't mine. Whoever had been living in my walls was gone. The police searched the building but never found the person. My landlord claimed he had no idea the crawl space even existed, though I'm not sure I believe him. I packed up and moved out the next day, breaking my lease without caring about the deposit. It's been months now, and I still don't sleep well. Every time I hear a creak in my new apartment, I tense up. Every time I wake up in the middle of the night, I listen, really listen, to make sure I'm alone. And I still wonder, how long had they been there? Watching, waiting, living right behind my walls.